The snow had been falling for hours by the time Josie reached the edge of the gathering hall, and she was already late. Not that it mattered. No one was waiting for her. No one ever really waited for Josie. She was simply expected to appear when needed, complete whatever task had been assigned, and disappear again before she became inconvenient. That was the particular rhythm of being the only human in service to a wolf pack, and she had long since stopped resenting it. She pulled her wool cloak tighter and adjusted the strap of the herb basket against her shoulder. The path leading to the hall's side entrance was lined with pine torches, their flames bending sideways in the wind, throwing long shadows across the stone walls. The smell of burning resin and wet earth rose around her with every step. Familiar smells, almost comforting, even now. The gathering of the 9 happened once a year, always on the night of the winter solstice. 9 packs, 9 banners. 9 alpha lords seated beneath the high vaulted ceiling of a hall built centuries ago from black stone and old oak, where every voice echoed and every silence meant something. It was the most important night in the wolf calendar, a night of alliances renewed, disputes settled, and power demonstrated with the careful precision of those who had always known exactly where they stood. Josie knew exactly where she stood too, somewhere near the bottom, but useful enough to keep around. She had been raised by Matilda, the Cinderfall Pack's elder healer, after her mother died of fever, and her father walked into the northern forest and never came back. She had been 8 years old. Matilda had taken her in without ceremony and without explanation, set her to work, learning the names of every root, bark, and dried flower in the healer's cottage, and said nothing more about it. That was 12 years ago. Josie was now 23, and she knew more about wound treatment, fever management, and pain relief than most pack healers half again her age. What she did not know was why Matilda had kept her, why a wolf healer would invest 12 years in training a human girl. She had asked once when she was 17 and bold enough to push. Matilda had looked at her for a long moment with those pale, unsettling eyes and said, "There are things in this world that wolves cannot smell and humans cannot see. You are neither. And therefore you are both." Then she had gone back to grinding dried valerian and refused to explain further. Josie had filed it away under things Matilda says that make no sense until they do, and moved on. She found the side entrance unlocked, slipped inside, and navigated through the narrow service corridor toward the preparation chamber. The sounds of the gathering filtered through the stone walls, low voices, the clink of goblets, occasional bursts of rough laughter from the warriors' tables. The hall smelled of smoked meat, pine resin, leather, and beneath all of it, the unmistakable layered scent of wolves gathered in number. Rich and wild and ancient, like the forest had walked indoors and sat down at the table, Matilda was already in the preparation chamber, bent over a long table covered in sorted herbs, not looking up when the door opened. "You're late," she said. The southern path was iced over. I had to go around. Josie set the basket down and began unpacking. I brought the wormwood root, 3 bundles, and the ash bark, because Corvin passed through the village before sundown, and he was favoring his left shoulder in a way that says blade wound, not sparring injury. Matilda's hand stilled for just a moment. Then she resumed sorting. "You noticed that from the road?" He was trying not to show it. That's always easier to spot than the injury itself. Josie set the last bundle on the table and straightened. "Is there anything else before I go?" "No." A pause. "Go home before the snow worsens. The northern path stays clearer, longer." It was a dismissal, and a rare thing from Matilda, something that almost resembled concern about Josie's safety. She accepted it without comment, collected her empty basket, and let herself back out through the side corridor. The northern path, as promised, was better, wide enough for 2 to walk abreast, flanked by old-growth pine that held the snow off the ground in patches. The moon was full and high, bright enough to cast sharp shadows, and Josie moved quickly, breath misting in the cold air, boots crunching steadily on the frozen ground. She had made it perhaps 10 minutes from the hall when she heard it. Not a sound, exactly. More like the wrong kind of silence, a gap in the forest's natural rhythm. The specific quiet that meant something living was struggling to stay still. Josie stopped walking, turned her head slowly toward the ravine running parallel to the path, maybe 20 feet down a steep embankment. She should have kept walking. Every sensible instinct she possessed told her to keep walking. It was the solstice gathering. 9 packs of wolves were assembled within a mile of where she stood, and whatever was in that ravine was none of her concern. And she was human and alone, and She was already moving down the embankment. The snow was deep at the bottom, swallowing her boots to the ankle with each step. She grabbed at exposed roots to slow her descent, pushed through a curtain of low pine branches, and stopped. The wolf was massive, even collapsed on his side in the snow, partially obscured by shadow and a coating of ice crystals on his fur. The sheer scale of him was immediately apparent. Pelage black as charcoal, darker than the shadows around him. Paws the size of her spread hand. Broad skull resting against a root, eyes closed and bleeding. Steadily, darkly, from a long gash along his right flank that had stained the snow beneath him in a wide, half-frozen pool. Josie crouched down without touching him yet. Assessment first. Always assessment first. The wound was not from a fight with another wolf. She had seen enough pack injuries over 12 years to know the difference between claw marks and a blade. This was a blade, clean-edged on one side, slightly ragged on the other, deep enough to have hit muscle. Someone had done this deliberately, and this wolf, rather than going to the hall where healers were present and help was available, had come here. To a ravine. Alone, hiding, she realized. He was hiding the injury. That's a profoundly bad idea, she said quietly. She always talked to injured animals. It kept her voice steady and her hands steady, and it seemed to help them too, though she had never found a satisfying explanation for why. You're going to bleed out trying to look fine. The wolf's ear moved, just slightly. He was conscious, or close to it. Josie opened the leather satchel at her hip, the one she carried everywhere, always, because Matilda had drilled into her that emergencies did not send advance notice. Waxed suture thread, clean linen folded in quarters. Her small, sharp knife, the tincture of calendula, a rolled bandage. Not enough, but enough to try. She pressed the folded linen against the wound with firm, steady pressure. The wolf made a sound low in his chest, not pain, exactly, warning. I know, Josie said, not moving her hands, but if I stop, you'll die here, and I find that unacceptable. A long moment. Then the tension went out of him, not completely, but enough. She worked without hesitation, cleaning the wound as best she could in the cold, suturing the deepest section with small, even stitches that Matilda had taught her to take pride in. The wolf remained still with a quality that struck her as deliberate. Not unconscious stillness, but the controlled motionlessness of something that had decided to allow this. That distinction mattered, though she couldn't have said exactly why. By the time she finished binding the wound and sat back on her heels, her hands were numb and her knees were soaked through with snow melt. The wolf's breathing had evened out. Slower, deeper, better. Josie looked at him for a moment in the moonlight. Then she did something she had never done before with a wolf, injured or otherwise. She reached out and rested her palm very gently against the side of his head, between his ear and his jaw. You should go back, she said quietly. Wherever you belong. Someone will be looking for you. The wolf opened his eyes. They were gold. Not the amber gold common to most wolves she had encountered, but a deeper, stranger shade. The color of firelight through old whiskey, lit from within by something that had no name in the human vocabulary for color. They fixed on her with an attention so complete and so still that Josie felt the breath leave her body. Not fear. Something else entirely, something she had even less of a name for. She withdrew her hand slowly, picked up her satchel, and stood. Stay warm, she said. Because she had to say something, and that was the best she had. She climbed back up the embankment without looking back. She told herself that was wisdom. She was not entirely sure she believed it. Josie did not sleep well. She told herself it was the cold. The drafts that crept through the gaps in her cottage walls were worse in deep winter, and her supply of firewood was lower than she would have liked. She told herself it was the long walk back, the wet boots, the numb fingers that had taken too long to warm. She told herself a number of reasonable, practical things, and none of them explained why she kept seeing a pair of gold eyes every time she closed her own. She was up before dawn, grinding dried elderberry into powder at the workbench by the window, when someone knocked. Not Matilda's knock. 3 short raps, the same pattern for 30 years. This was 2 knocks, firm and unhurried. The kind of knock that expected the door to open without having to ask twice. Josie set down the pestle and went to the door. The man standing outside was tall enough that he nearly filled the frame, and that was before accounting for the width of his shoulders beneath a charcoal gray traveling cloak dusted with snow. dark hair, slightly damp. A jaw that looked like it had been carved with the specific intention of making people uncomfortable, and eyes, even in the pale gray light of early morning, even before she had fully processed anything else about him, gold. The same deep, impossible gold that had looked up at her from the floor of a ravine the night before. Josie stared at him. He looked back at her with an expression of complete composure, as though finding the door of a human healer's cottage at dawn in the aftermath of a blizzard was entirely unremarkable. "Your stitching," he said, "is excellent." She opened the door wider without quite deciding to. "You shifted. I heal faster in human form once the wound is closed." He said it the way someone might explain that they preferred their tea without honey. A simple statement of personal preference, nothing more. "I came to return this." He held out her rolled bandage, the one she had used to bind the wound. It had been cleaned and re-rolled with a precision that suggested either a great deal of time or a great deal of habit. "And to ask your name. You came at dawn in a snowstorm to return a bandage and ask my name." "Yes." Josie considered him for a moment. There was no threat in his posture, but there was weight. The particular, pressurized quality of someone who occupied a great deal of space in the world without needing to make noise about it. She had been around enough high-ranking wolves to recognize authority when it stood in front of her. This man had it in quantities that made most alpha lords she had encountered seem like they were still practicing. "Josie," she said, "and yours?" "Evander." No pack name offered, no title, just the single word, delivered without elaboration, as though the name itself should be sufficient context. Josie filed that away. "Are you in pain?" she asked. Because that was the practical question, and practical questions were solid ground. "Some. Less than I should be, considering." His gaze moved briefly past her to the workbench. The hanging bundles of dried herbs, the rows of small clay pots lined up along the shelf above the fireplace. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "You live alone." "I do." "And you walked back from the ravine alone. Last night, after dark." "I've walked that path 100 times." "That isn't what I said." Josie looked at him steadily. "I'm aware of the risks of being human in wolf territory after dark. I've been aware of them for most of my life. I manage." He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone thinking of what to say next, but the quiet of someone listening to something she hadn't said out loud. It was an unsettling quality, and she suspected he knew it. "May I come in?" he said, "so you can check that the stitching held." It was phrased as a question, but had the texture of something more certain than that. Josie stepped back from the door. He moved through her small cottage with the careful, deliberate economy of a large thing in a small space. Not clumsy, not hesitant, just precise in a way that suggested he was always aware of exactly how much room he took up. He sat where she indicated, at the bench by the window, and removed his cloak and the linen shirt beneath it without being asked, which saved her the trouble of asking. The wound was on his right flank, just as it had been on the wolf. She had known it would be. Still, seeing the neat line of her own stitches on human skin, in daylight, with this particular man sitting silently in front of her, it had a strangeness to it that she chose not to examine closely. She checked the sutures with clean hands. The bleeding had stopped completely. The edges were holding well, slightly pink with the beginning of healing rather than the angry red of infection. Wolves healed faster than humans in any form, but this was faster even than that. "It's clean," she said. "No infection. The stitches can come out in 4 days if you heal the way you appear to be healing." She paused. "What happened?" "An ambush. 3 men. They were waiting on the path between the hall and the northern ridge. Were they from one of the 9 packs?" A slight pause. "Possibly. You didn't go inside. You didn't call for help." "No." She straightened and moved to her shelf to mix a small pot of healing salve, beeswax base, calendula, yarrow, a small amount of powdered pine resin for the cold. Her hands moved through the process automatically while she thought. "If you had died in that ravine," she said carefully, "would it have caused significant problems for someone?" The silence that followed had a different quality than his previous ones. More considered, more watchful. "Yes," he said finally. "It would have caused significant problems for a great many people. Then you should be more careful." She brought the salve to him and began applying it to the wound with 2 fingers, even strokes. High-value targets don't wander alone on unlit paths during the gathering. Something moved across his expression. The briefest flash of something that in another man she might have called amusement, though on this face it was more restrained than that. Barely a shift at the corner of his mouth. "Noted," he said. She finished with the salve, covered the wound with a fresh linen pad, and secured it with a strip of clean cloth. Professional. Efficient. She stepped back and met his eyes, which had been on her face with that same complete, unblinking attention for longer than was comfortable. "You should eat something before you go," she said, because her instincts as a healer overruled the part of her that wanted him to leave before she had to figure out what to do with the way he was looking at her. "Blood loss. Your body needs to rebuild." He did not object. That surprised her more than almost anything else about the morning. She put bread and hard cheese and a cup of warmed broth on the table, and he ate without commentary while she cleaned her workbench and tried to behave as though having a large, gold-eyed, unnamed pack stranger sitting in her kitchen at dawn was something that happened with regularity. When he finished, he rose, pulled on his shirt, and settled the cloak back across his shoulders. He was nearly at the door when he stopped and turned back. "Josie." He said her name as though testing its weight. "What you did last night, for a wolf you didn't know, in the dark, alone. Most people would not have done that." She looked at him from across the room. "Most people weren't there." That thing happened at the corner of his mouth again, slightly more pronounced this time. "No," he said, "they weren't." He left without telling her which pack he belonged to, without explaining the ambush, without offering any of the context that might have made the previous 12 hours make more sense. The door closed quietly behind him. Josie stood in the middle of her cottage for a long moment, listening to the sound of his footsteps crossing the frozen ground outside, and then the silence when they stopped. She went back to the elderberry powder. She ground it finer than she needed to. By mid-morning, Matilda arrived with her usual 3 knocks, her coat heavy with snow, and her expression set in its habitual arrangement of knowing more than she said. She accepted the cup of tea Josie handed her, sat in the chair by the fire, and looked around the room with those pale eyes that missed nothing. She paused when she reached the bench by the window, where Evander had sat, where the impression of him, something between pine resin and deep winter cold and something older and wilder beneath both, still lingered in the air. Matilda looked at Josie for a long moment. "What did you do last night?" she asked very quietly. "I helped an injured wolf," Josie said. "As you taught me." Matilda set down her cup. Her hands, Josie noticed, were not entirely steady. "Describe him," she said. Josie described him the way she would describe any patient, methodically, starting with the physical details that mattered clinically and working outward. The size of the wolf, the nature of the wound, the unusual speed of his recovery. She mentioned that he had shifted and come to her door at dawn. She gave Matilda his name. She did not mention his eyes. She was not sure why. Matilda sat with her hands folded around her teacup, and her gaze fixed on the middle distance for a long time after Josie finished. The fire crackled. Snow tapped quietly against the window. The silence stretched long enough that Josie began to feel the edges of it. "Matilda, you need to understand something." The old healer's voice was lower than usual, stripped of its customary briskness. "The name you were given this morning is not a common name. It is not carried by minor lords or wandering wolves or soldiers of middling rank." She paused. "It belongs to one man in this territory. One man only." Josie waited. "Evander Ashvale," Matilda said carefully, as though the full name required handling. "Alpha King of the Consolidated Packs, ruler of all 9 territories represented at last night's gathering." Another pause. "The man to whom every Alpha Lord in this region answers." The room felt very still. Josie sat down. "He was alone," she said, more to herself than to Matilda. "He was bleeding in a ravine. He was—" She stopped, reorganized. "He didn't tell me." "No, he wouldn't." Matilda finally looked at her directly, and the expression on her face was something Josie had never seen there before. Not quite fear, but its more experienced cousin. "Josie, what exactly did you say to him?" Josie thought back through the morning with uncomfortable precision. High-value targets don't wander alone on unlit paths during the gathering. She had said that directly to the Alpha King's face, while applying salve to his ribs, having previously told him that bleeding out in a ravine would be a waste. "Nothing irreversible," she said, with more confidence than she felt. Matilda closed her eyes briefly. "The ambush he mentioned, 3 men on the northern path. That will already be a crisis of the highest order. The fact that the king was injured during his own gathering, that someone within the 9 packs made an attempt on his life. She shook her head. And you were there. You touched him. You have his scent on your hands and his presence in your home. I was helping him. I know that. You know that. Matilda's voice was firm but careful. Whether his court knows that is an entirely separate question. The weight of it settled over Josie gradually, the way cold did when you had been outside too long. Not all at once, but in layers, each one heavier than the last. She had not saved a wounded wolf. She had saved the Alpha King, the most powerful man in 9 territories, in secret, while he was hiding an assassination attempt. And then she had told him to be more careful, and given him bread and cheese at her kitchen table. "What do I do?" she asked. "Nothing," Matilda said firmly. "You do nothing. You were not there. You saw nothing. If anyone asks about last night, you came, you delivered the herbs, you went home. He knows where I live." "Yes." Matilda's expression made clear she found this the most significant problem. "He does." He came back 4 days later, as she had told him he could. She had spent those 4 days telling herself she was not watching the path from the window. She had been largely unsuccessful. On the morning of the 4th day, she rose early and had tea ready before she admitted to herself why. He arrived just after sunrise, alone again, wearing a plain wool tunic and riding trousers that bore no insignia, no rank marker, nothing to distinguish him from any other large, unsettling man who might appear at a healer's door at dawn. Which is to say the disguise, if it was one, was entirely unconvincing if you were paying attention, and Josie was constitutionally incapable of not paying attention. She let him in without a word and pointed at the bench. He sat. She removed the linen pad, checked the wound with clean hands, and found it nearly closed. A thin, pale line where 4 days ago there had been a deep gash requiring sutures. The stitches could come out. She removed them one by one with small, precise scissors, and he sat absolutely still throughout, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he existed in the world, in a state of chosen stillness that had nothing passive about it. "It healed cleanly," she said, stepping back. "You're done." "Thank you." He glanced down at the faint line on his ribs, then back at her. "You knew." "By the time I came back, it was not a question. Matilda told me." "What did she tell you?" "Your full name, your title." She held his gaze steadily. "That every Alpha Lord in 9 territories answers to you." He watched her face with that unblinking attention. And I would have done the same thing either way," she said. "In case that was the question you were actually asking." Something shifted in his expression. Not the brief, almost amusement she had seen before. Something quieter than that, and considerably more serious. He looked at her for a long moment with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "It was," he said. She moved to the shelf to put away her instruments, because keeping her hands occupied was preferable to standing still under that gaze. "The men who ambushed you. Did you find out who sent them? I have a strong suspicion. Confirmation is being pursued." A pause. "How much do you know about the politics of the 9 packs? Enough. Matilda doesn't exist in isolation." She began sorting a bundle of dried rosemary, without particular necessity. "Lord Castellan of the Sable Pack has been positioning against central authority for 3 seasons. His second son was passed over for a seat on your war council last year, and 2 of the 3 packs bordering his territory have quietly reduced their tribute shipments without formal dispute, which means they're waiting to see which way a conflict goes before committing." Silence. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression she had not seen on him yet. Not the composure, not the near amusement. Something more alert than either. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "People talk around healers the way they talk around furniture. They forget we're in the room." She set down the rosemary. "I've been furniture at the Gathering Hall preparations for 6 years." He was quiet for a moment that felt different from his other silences. More active. As though something was being assessed and reassessed behind those gold eyes in rapid succession. "The attempt on my life," he said slowly, "was made by 2 men in Castellan's service, and one I have not yet identified. The unidentified man carried a blade treated with a compound that slows wolf healing. That's why the wound was deeper than it should have been, and why it bled longer. Josie stilled. A compound that slows wolf healing, she repeated. Our court healer has not identified it. She turned fully to face him. Her mind was already moving through the possibilities with the particular speed it reserved for problems that had solutions, if you knew where to look. A blade treatment that impaired wolf regeneration. The components would need to interfere with the pack bond's healing current. There were 3 plants she knew of that could do that in concentration. One of them grew only in the high northern valleys. One was a derivative of a root Matilda had a locked cabinet for. And the third... Sit down, she said. He raised an eyebrow very slightly. Please, she added, because apparently she was capable of giving orders to the Alpha King, and then remembering her manners approximately 3 seconds later. I need to ask you about the wound, specifically how it felt when it happened. He sat. She pulled her stool close and leaned forward, and asked him 11 questions in quick succession about the sensation of the injury, the rate and color of the bleeding, whether he had experienced any numbness in the surrounding tissue or unusual temperature at the wound site. He answered each one with the precise detail of someone who was paying attention to her reasoning in real time and matching it with his own. By the end, she sat back and looked at him with something that was half concern and half a dark, simmering anger she hadn't expected to feel. It's nightshade compound, she said. Specifically, a cold extraction concentrate. It's not difficult to make if you know how, but the knowledge isn't common. She paused. It isn't common among wolves. It comes from human herbalist tradition. Old tradition. Older than most packs. His eyes held hers. Someone with access to that knowledge, he said carefully, either is human or has a human source. Yes. The anger sharpened. And there are not very many humans with that depth of knowledge living within range of the 9 territories. She met his gaze directly. I want you to know that I am telling you this because it is true, and because you need to know it, not because I'm trying to redirect suspicion from myself. I understand that distinction may be difficult to accept. It isn't, he said simply. She blinked. I know what I smelled in that ravine, he said. I know what I've smelled in this room both times. You don't carry fear the way a guilty person does. You carry it the way someone does when they're trying very hard to think clearly under pressure. A pause. Which is what you're doing right now. Josie realized her jaw had tightened. She deliberately relaxed it. That is a very specific observation, she said. I pay attention. He said it without inflection, but his eyes didn't move from her face. As do you. The fire popped behind her. Outside, wind moved through the pine branches with a sound like a slow exhale. Josie was acutely aware of how small the cottage was, and how much of it he occupied without appearing to try. There's one more thing, she said, because she needed to say it, and the moment was either now or never. The nightshade compound, if a second dose had been delivered within 12 hours of the first, even a wolf with your recovery rate would not have survived it. She held his gaze. Whoever sent those men was not trying to weaken you or send a message. They were trying to kill you completely and permanently. The silence that followed was the heaviest one yet. I know, Evander said quietly. The investigation moved quietly, the way powerful things often did when they did not wish to be seen moving. Josie knew this because Evander came back. Not every day, not with any pattern she could predict, but with a consistency that accumulated meaning whether she assigned it one or not. Sometimes he arrived in the morning with questions about the nightshade compound, its preparation, its sources, the specific knowledge required to produce a cold extraction concentrate of sufficient potency. Sometimes he arrived later, when the light was already low and gold through the cottage window, and the questions were less precise, and the conversations wandered further from their starting points. She told herself it was practical. He needed her knowledge. She had information relevant to an assassination attempt against the ruling authority of 9 packs. It was logical, sensible, and entirely explicable. She ground a great deal of herbs she didn't need during those 2 weeks. Clara noticed, because Clara noticed everything. Clara was Josie's closest friend, and had been since childhood. A wolf of the Cinderfall pack, low-ranking but sharp-eyed, with a talent for reading situations that Josie had always privately envied. She arrived one afternoon to find Josie reorganizing her salve shelf for the second time that week, sat down uninvited at the kitchen table, and watched her in silence for long enough to make the silence itself a question. What? Josie said, without turning around. You tell me, Clara said pleasantly. There's nothing to tell. You've rearranged that shelf 3 times since I sat down. A pause. Also, your cottage smells like someone very large and very important has been sitting in it repeatedly. And I say that as a wolf who is trying very hard not to say what I actually want to say. Josie turned around. Clara's expression was somewhere between fascinated and deeply concerned, which was the expression it took on when she had already assembled most of a picture and was waiting for the final piece to confirm it. He's a source, Josie said carefully, for the investigation into the ambush. Clara stared at her. Josie. What? That is the Alpha King's scent in your home. I'm aware. You are aware. Clara set her palms flat on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone managing their own reaction. You are aware that the Alpha King has been sitting in your kitchen, and your response is, he's a source. He needed information about the compound used on his wound. I have that information. It's a practical arrangement. Clara looked at her for a very long moment, with an expression of profound, affectionate disbelief. Then she leaned forward. Josie, I have known you since you were 10 years old, and you tried to splint a raven's broken wing with 2 twigs and a piece of your own hair ribbon. I know what your practical face looks like. She paused. That is not your practical face. Josie opened her mouth, closed it. He comes here, Clara said, more gently now. He comes here, specifically, when he could send any one of 100 court officials or warriors to gather information. He comes alone. He comes back. She tilted her head slightly. What does he talk about when he's not asking about the compound? Josie turned back to the shelf. Things. Illuminating. The pacts, the politics. He asks what I've observed over the years, what I've heard, what I think about the alliances and the fault lines. She paused, straightening a pot that didn't need straightening. Sometimes about other things, the forest, Matilda. Why I stayed in wolf territory after I grew old enough to leave. The silence behind her had changed quality. What did you tell him? Clara asked. About why you stayed. Josie was quiet for a moment, that I stopped thinking of it as wolf territory a long time ago. It's just where I live. She heard Clara exhale slowly. Josie, she said very quietly. Be careful. I know what I am. I know what he is. She kept her voice even. I'm not confused about that. I know you're not confused. A pause. I'm not worried about confusion. The confirmation came 12 days after Josie had identified the compound. She heard about it the way she heard about most things, through Matilda, who heard it through the network of pack healers that moved information as efficiently as they moved medicinal supplies. Lord Castellan of the Sable Pack had been formally brought before the Alpha King's War Council and presented with evidence of his role in the assassination attempt. 2 of his men had confessed under questioning. The third man, the unidentified one with the nightshade blade, turned out to be a disgraced herbalist who had been in Castellan's private employ for 4 years, a human man who had sold his knowledge to the highest bidder and whose connection to the old herbalist tradition had provided exactly the access Josie had identified. Castellan was stripped of his title, his territory placed under the direct governance of the crown, his family given 30 days to vacate the Sable Pack's ancestral hall. It was decisive and swift, and left no room for the waiting packs on his borders to continue their careful neutrality. Within a week, 2 of the 3 had sent formal tribute and renewed oaths. The third followed 3 days after that. Matilde delivered this information to Josie over tea with the same tone she used to discuss weather patterns and herb harvests. Then she set down her cup and looked at Josie with those pale, knowing eyes. He told his council that the compound was identified by an independent healer with specialist knowledge, she said. He did not give your name. He did not give your location. Josie absorbed this. He protected you, Matilda said simply, deliberately. He came that evening. The sun was already below the tree line, the sky a deep, bruised blue above the pines, when she heard the particular rhythm of his footfall on the frozen path. She had learned it by now, unhurried, evenly weighted, the gait of someone who moved through the world without bracing against it. She had the door open before he knocked. He looked at her for a moment in the low light. Snow beginning to gather on the shoulders of his dark cloak, and something in his expression was different tonight. Less contained. Not uncontrolled. She suspected he was rarely uncontrolled, but carrying something closer to the surface than usual. You heard, he said. Matilda told me. This morning. She stepped back to let him in. You didn't give my name to the council. No. He came inside and stood near the fire, his hands loose at his sides. He didn't sit. Giving your name would have drawn attention to you that you haven't asked for and don't need. The court has long memories and complicated politics. A human woman with deep knowledge of wolf-targeted compounds found alone in the forest with an injured king. He paused. The narrative writes itself in ways that would not have been good for you. I know. She stood a few feet away, watching him. Thank you. He looked at her directly. You saved my life, Josie. Protecting you from unnecessary consequences is not generosity. It's the minimum. The fire shifted behind her, throwing warm light across the angles of his face, and she thought, not for the first time but more clearly than before, that he was a profoundly difficult person to look away from, not because of anything showy or loud about him, because of the opposite, because everything about him was so entirely deliberate that attention felt like the only rational response. There's something else, he said. Tell me, the herbalist who made the compound. Before he was taken into custody, he spoke to someone. We don't know who. What he told them, we also don't know. He held her gaze steadily, but the people who wanted me dead are aware now that someone identified the compound and led us to him. They don't know who, but they're looking. The implications settled over her with uncomfortable clarity. You think they'll trace it back to a healer, she said. To a human healer with specialist knowledge, yes. There aren't many of you. He paused. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I know. She thought for a moment. You're telling me because I need to decide something. Yes. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire was the only sound in the room. What are the options? She asked. You could leave the territory entirely. I can arrange passage and resources. You would be safe, but you would have to go far and stay gone. He said it without expression, but something in his jaw had tightened very slightly. Or you could come to the court, under my protection, openly, as the healer who assisted in the investigation. In the open, you're visible, but visibility has its own protection. No one moves against someone standing in plain sight of the crown. Josie turned to the window. Outside, the snow was falling properly now, thick and quiet, filling in the spaces between the pine trees. She had lived in this cottage for 12 years. She had learned everything she knew in these walls, on these paths, in this forest. She had not realized until this moment, faced with the possibility of leaving it, how completely this place had become the inside of herself. If I come to the court, she said slowly, I would be under scrutiny, a human woman in a wolf court. People would ask questions about why you brought me, what I am to you, whether you could be influenced through me. Yes, he said, they would. And your answer to those questions would need to be something the court accepted. My answer to those questions, he said quietly, would be the truth. She turned from the window. He was watching her with that complete, unblinking attention, and the thing that had been close to the surface all evening was fully visible now. Not hidden. Not performed. Simply there. Held out in the open with the same deliberateness he brought to everything else. Which is? She said very carefully, that you are someone I came back to, he said. Not because of the investigation, not because of the compound or the politics or anything practical. A pause. Because the first thing you said to me when I was bleeding in a ravine was that dying there would be a waste, and every conversation since then has confirmed that you are entirely correct about most things, and I find that I am not ready to stop having them. Josie's heart did something she chose not to catalog in clinical terms. That answer, she said after a moment, is going to cause significant complications for you. Probably. He didn't look remotely concerned about this. I'm human. I'm aware. Your court? My court, he said, with a very slight but unmistakable firmness, answers to me. She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight and the snow quiet of the room. Give me until morning, she said. He nodded once. He picked up his cloak. At the door he paused and looked back at her, and the gold of his eyes in the low light was the same as it had been in the ravine, lit from within by something that had no simple name. Whatever you decide, he said, I'll make sure you're safe. That doesn't change. He left. The door closed softly. Josie stood in the middle of her cottage for a long time, listening to the snow. She made her decision before midnight. It did not come from weighing the options the way she would weigh a compound, measuring each element against the others, calculating ratios, testing for reactions. It came from something quieter than that. She sat by the fire until the logs burned down to coals, and at some point in that long stillness, she stopped asking herself what the sensible choice was, and started asking herself what was true. Those turned out to be the same thing, which surprised her less than it probably should have. She wrote a note for Matilda and left it folded on the kitchen table with a small bundle of dried rosemary on top, because Matilda would understand the rosemary in a way that words alone wouldn't carry. Then she packed what mattered, her instruments, her satchel, her reference collection of dried specimens, the small carved wooden box her mother had left her, and she sat back down by the fire and waited for morning. Evander arrived at first light. He looked at the packed bag by the door, and then at her, and said nothing. He didn't need to. "I have conditions," Josie said. "Tell me." "I work as a healer, not as an ornament, not as a political symbol. I see patients. I manage a proper dispensary. I am consulted on medical matters with the same weight given to any specialist." She held his gaze. "I am not managed or redirected or kept quiet when I have something relevant to say." "Agreed. Clara comes with me if she chooses to. She's Cinderfall Pack, and she'd need a transfer of affiliation. But that's within your authority to arrange." "Also agreed. And I need Matilda's blessing, not her permission. I'm old enough to not need permission. Her blessing. Those are different things, and I won't leave without it." Something moved through his expression, not the near amusement, something warmer and more considered than that. He looked at her the way she was beginning to recognize as his particular version of being moved by something, which was very still and very direct, and said more than most people managed with words. "All of it," he said simply. "All of it," agreed. She nodded once, picked up her bag, and went to find Matilda. The old healer was already awake, as Josie had known she would be. Matilda had always seemed to exist slightly ahead of events, as though the world sent her a quiet advance notice that it withheld from everyone else. She was at her workbench when Josie arrived, grinding something that smelled of pine bark and cloves, and she did not look up immediately. Josie set the empty herb basket on the table, the same basket she had carried to the gathering hall on the night of the solstice, the night that had begun all of this, and stood quietly, waiting. Matilda stopped grinding. She looked at the basket. Then she looked at Josie. "You're going," she said. "Yes." The old healer was quiet for a long moment. Outside her window, the morning was pale and clean. The snow from the night before resting undisturbed on every surface, the world briefly remade and simplified. "I told you once," Matilda said slowly, "that there are things wolves cannot smell and humans cannot see. That you were neither, and therefore both." She paused. "I was not speaking poetically." Josie waited. "Your mother came to me when you were 3 years old." Matilda set down the pestle with the care of someone handling something fragile. "She told me that your father was not the man she had married, that the man she had married was gone, and the one who remained had a darkness in him she didn't trust around a child." She paused. "She asked me to keep a particular knowledge safe until you were old enough to carry it." The room was very still. "Your mother's grandmother," Matilda said carefully, "was born into the Ashvale line, a distant branch, long removed from the main bloodline, long since living as humans, but the blood does not forget itself entirely, even when those carrying it do." She met Josie's eyes. "You are not fully human, Josie. You never were. You have been living at the edges of what you are for 23 years, and perhaps now it is time to stop." Josie stood in the middle of Matilda's cottage and felt the information settle into her the way deep truths always did, not as a shock, but as a recognition, as the answer to a question she had been asking without knowing she was asking it. Why she had never quite fit anywhere. Why the wolves around her had always treated her as more than furniture even when they tried not to. Why Matilda had kept her. Why the forest felt like home. Why perhaps a certain pair of gold eyes had looked at her in a ravine and recognized something that shouldn't have been there. "Does he know?" she asked quietly. "I don't know what he knows." Matilda rose from her bench and came to stand before Josie, and her expression was the most unguarded Josie had ever seen it. No briskness, no careful management, just an old woman who had kept a long faith and was releasing it now into the right hands. "I know that whatever he sensed in you was real. And I know that you have always been more than you were told you were." She reached out and put both her hands on Josie's face, briefly, the way she had done exactly twice before in Josie's memory. Once when Josie was 10 and had fallen from a tree and thought she might be dying, and once when she was 17 and grieving something she hadn't been able to name. "Go," Matilda said, "and be entirely yourself. That has always been enough." Clara came. Of course Clara came. She arrived at the cottage with a bag already packed, which meant she had made her decision sometime in the night before Josie had asked her, which was so thoroughly Clara that Josie felt the tightness in her chest ease for the first time since the solstice. "You could have warned me," Josie said. "You would have told me not to do anything rash." Clara shouldered her bag with a grin that didn't quite cover how much she meant it. This way was faster. They left as the morning light was turning gold through the pines, Josie and Clara walking ahead, while Evander followed at a slight distance with the particular tact of a man who understood when presence was supportive and when it was intrusive. The village fell away behind them. The path through the forest opened ahead, wide and winter-pale, leading north toward the Crown territory. At the edge of the tree line, the last point from which her cottage was still visible, Josie stopped and turned back for a moment. 12 years of a life, a workbench worn smooth at the edges, bundles of herbs hanging from ceiling beams, the window that let in the morning light at exactly the right angle for fine work, the fire that had kept her warm through more winters than she had expected to survive alone. She held it in her mind clearly and completely, and then she turned around and kept walking. The court of the Alpha King was everything she had expected, and nothing she had been prepared for. It was vast in the way that genuine power was vast. Not showy, not ornamented beyond function, but built for permanence in a way that made you feel the weight of every generation that had stood in the same halls. Black stone walls, high and thick. Torches in iron brackets, throwing warm light across corridors wide enough to ride 3 horses abreast. The banners of the consolidated packs, hanging in rows beneath the great arched ceiling, with the crimson and wolf of the royal line at the center above everything else. The court watched her arrive with the careful, layered attention of wolves who had spent their lives reading rooms. She felt the assessment in every glance. The human woman walking at the Alpha King's side, carrying a healer's satchel, meeting eyes without flinching. She heard the silence that moved through the entrance hall like a wave, and settled into something more complicated than either acceptance or rejection. She had expected to feel out of place. She felt, instead, the particular steadiness of someone standing exactly where they are supposed to be. Evander introduced her to his council with a plainness that left no room for reinterpretation. She was Josie. She had identified the compound that nearly killed him. She would be establishing the court's first dedicated healing dispensary with full specialist authority, and she was under his personal protection, by his deliberate choice, for reasons that were his own, and not subject to council review. The oldest council member, a gray-muzzled wolf named Aldrich, who looked as though he had been carved from the same stone as the walls, studied her for a long moment after this introduction. Then he said, "The Ashvale line has always had good instincts," and he looked at her with an expression that knew something, or suspected something, or had simply lived long enough to recognize when a pattern was completing itself. Josie met his eyes and said nothing. But she understood. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty. A court in motion had edges, and learning to navigate them required attention and patience, and occasionally the willingness to hold her ground when people tested whether she would. Some did it from genuine concern about her place in a wolf court. Some did it from politics. Some did it simply because testing was the only language they knew. She held her ground each time, not loudly. With the same steadiness she brought to difficult wound treatments, focused, precise, unwilling to be moved from what was true. Clara integrated into the court's lower guard with a speed that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this environment all her life. She wrote to Josie 3 weeks in. They were living in adjacent chambers in the East Wing, with a note that said simply, "I have found 17 people more dramatic than either of us. I am thriving." Mathilde visited once, in the deep cold of late winter, and spent 2 days examining the dispensary with the critical eye of someone who had set the standard being measured against. On the morning she left, she told Josie that the herb storage was acceptable, and that the drying racks needed to be repositioned for better air circulation. Then she gripped Josie's hand briefly, said nothing more, and walked back down the northern path. Josie watched her go and understood that this was Matilda's particular way of saying that everything was as it should be. It was Evander himself who told her about the blood. Not immediately. He told her 3 months after her arrival, in the evening, in the small study off the Great Hall, where they had developed the habit of ending the day in conversation. reviewing what the day had been, what the next day would require, and inevitably wandering far from both subjects into territory that belonged to neither politics nor medicine. He told her because Aldrich had confirmed what Matilda had kept for 2 decades, and because he believed she deserved to know everything that was known. She listened. She asked 2 precise questions. Then she sat with it for a moment in the firelit quiet. "It changes nothing about what I am," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "It explains some things. It changes nothing." She looked at him across the low table between them, at the gold of his eyes in the firelight, at the face that had by now become as familiar to her as the cottage window at morning, and considerably more significant. She thought about a ravine in the snow, about hands that didn't tremble in the presence of suffering, about the specific and particular quality of choosing to descend an embankment in the dark, towards something unknown, because the alternative was to keep walking, and she had never been able to do that. "You knew something was different about me," she said, "in the ravine. I knew something was real about you," he said carefully. "The difference matters." She was quiet for a moment. "Is it complicated?" "For the court. My lineage being what it is. It simplifies certain things considerably, actually." A pause. "Though I want to be clear that it would not have changed my answer either way." She believed him. That was the thing about Evander. He did not say things he did not mean, and he did not mean things halfway. It was occasionally inconvenient, and consistently the most trustworthy quality she had ever encountered. "Your answer to what?" she asked, though she knew. He held her gaze with that complete, deliberate attention, and the warmth in it was nothing like contained. "To you," he said simply. "To all of this. To whatever comes next." Josie looked at him for a long moment in the warmth and quiet of the room, in the court that had become her home, in the life she had descended a snowy embankment to find without knowing that was what she was doing. "Yes," she said. She did not specify what she was answering. She didn't need to. He understood her precisely, as he always had, and she understood him, as she always had, and that was the whole of it. Outside, the winter was ending. In the dispensary, 2 corridors away, her instruments were arranged exactly as she had ordered them, and tomorrow there would be work to do and problems to solve, and a court full of wolves learning, gradually and with occasional resistance, that the woman in the East Wing knew exactly what she was doing and was not going anywhere. Lord Castellan's former territories had been redistributed across 3 stable packs by spring, his name reduced to a footnote in the council records. He had sent no messages and received none. Whatever he had imagined he was dismantling when he sent 3 men to a snowy path, it had not been dismantled. It had been, in a way he could not have planned for, completed. Clara was promoted to the king's inner guard before the first thaw, a fact she reported to Josie with elaborate casualness that fooled neither of them. Matilda's rosemary, replanted in the dispensary's south window box, took root in the first week of spring and grew with the particular stubbornness of things that belong where they are. And Josie, who had walked a familiar path in the dark and made an unremarkable decision to help something suffering, not knowing it would change everything, not knowing it would lead her here, stood at the dispensary window on the first warm morning of the year and watched the light come through the pine trees and felt with complete and uncomplicated certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She always had been. It had just taken the right darkness and the right pair of gold eyes looking up at her from the snow to show her the way home.